The laughter came fast and cruel. A young waitress stood frozen under the bright lights of a crowded restaurant as a billionaire leaned back in his chair, smiling like she was nothing more than a joke. "You speak 8 languages," Kwame Mensah mocked, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "Then entertain us." Eyes turned, phones lifted. The room held its breath. Dalal Hassan didn't argue. She didn't beg. She simply looked at him and began to speak. Not 1 language, not 2, and suddenly the laughter stopped. Because what she said next would leave the entire room silent. "Before we continue, tell me, where are you watching from and what time is it there right now?" If stories like this move, you don't forget to subscribe and be part of this journey. Dalal Hassan woke up before the sun, as she always did. In the quiet gray of early morning, when the city of Accra had not yet found its voice, she sat on the edge of her narrow bed and listened to the distant hum of generators, the soft cry of a baby somewhere beyond the thin walls, and the uneven breathing of her younger brother Yasin. Their room was small, barely large enough for the 2 of them. A single window let in a tired stream of light, and the paint on the walls had long surrendered to time. But Dalal never complained, not out loud. She turned her head and watched Yasin sleep, his thin frame curled under a worn blanket. Even in rest, there was tension in his face, the kind no child should carry. He had learned too early what it meant to go without comfort, without certainty, sometimes even without enough food. Dalal stood quietly, careful not to wake him, and reached for the small plastic basin near the door. The water inside was cold, but she splashed her face anyway, forcing herself into the day. "Today will be better," she whispered, though she didn't know if she believed it. She dressed in her uniform, a simple white shirt and a dark skirt, both carefully washed the night before. The fabric was beginning to thin in places, but she pressed it neatly, smoothing every wrinkle, as if that alone could protect her dignity. Before leaving, she placed a small plate of bread beside Yasin's bed. "Eat when you wake up," she murmured softly, brushing a hand across his forehead. "I'll bring something better tonight." It was a promise she had made too many times. The restaurant where Dalal worked was nothing like the life she returned to each night. Located in one of Accra's most affluent districts, it gleamed with polished glass, golden lighting, and quiet luxury. Wealth lived in its walls. You could hear it in the way people spoke, slow, confident, unafraid of tomorrow. Dalal moved through that world like a shadow. She arrived early as always, tying her apron while others drifted in lazily. The manager, Mr. Kofi Adu, stood near the entrance, inspecting everything with a sharp, impatient gaze. "You're late," he said without looking at her. Dalal glanced at the clock. She was not. "I'm sorry, sir," she replied anyway. He gave a small grunt and waved her off, already turning his attention to someone else. This was how it worked here. Apologies came first. Fairness, if it ever arrived, came last. The morning shift was slow, mostly business meetings and quiet conversations over coffee. Dalal moved from table to table, attentive but invisible. In this place, one of the older waitresses had told her on her first day, "You are not supposed to exist. You serve and disappear." Dalal had learned quickly. But there were moments, small and fleeting, when she could not disappear. Like when a French-speaking couple struggled to explain their order frustration growing between them and the staff. The other waitresses hesitated, exchanging uncertain glances. Dalal stepped forward. "Bonjour, comment puis-je vous aider?" she asked gently. The couple's faces lit up in relief. From that moment, the tension dissolved. Words flowed easily, smiles returned, and the order was completed without trouble. When Dalal stepped away, one of her co-workers, Abena, leaned in close. "Show off," she whispered under her breath. Dalal said nothing. It happened again later that afternoon. A man from Morocco, confused about the menu, struggled to communicate with the kitchen staff. His voice grew sharper, his patience thinner. Dalal approached calmly. "Marhaban hal yumkinuni musa'adatak?" she asked. The man blinked surprised, and then nodded quickly, gratitude replacing irritation. Once again Dalal solved the problem. Once again she walked away quietly. By the time the lunch rush ended, the whispers had already begun. "She thinks she's better than us. 8 languages, really? Why is she still a waitress?" Then Dalal heard everything. She always did. But she had learned something long ago: words could not break you if you refused to carry them. Still, some days were harder than others. During her short break, Dalal stepped outside the back of the restaurant. The sun was high now, unforgiving in its heat. She leaned against the wall and closed her eyes for a moment, letting the warmth settle over her. From inside she could hear laughter. Rich laughter. Easy laughter. She wondered not for the first time what it felt like to laugh without thinking of tomorrow. Her hand slipped into her bag, pulling out a small, worn notebook. The edges were frayed, the pages filled with careful handwriting, in different scripts: Arabic, English, French, even fragments of languages she had never fully mastered, but refused to forget. She turned a page, slowly tracing the words with her finger. This was her world. Not the restaurant, not the uniform. This. Language had been her escape once. Now it was the only piece of herself she had left untouched. "Break is over," a voice snapped. Dalal looked up. Mr. Kofi stood in the doorway, arms crossed. "Yes, sir." She slipped the notebook back into her bag and returned inside. The evening shift was different. Busier, louder, more unpredictable. And tonight, something felt different. Dalal noticed it the moment the doors opened again. There was a shift in the air, a kind of tension that didn't belong to ordinary guests. Then she saw them. A group of men entered dressed in tailored suits that spoke of money without needing to say it. At the center of them walked a man whose presence silenced the room without effort. Kwame Mensah. Even Dalal knew the name. Everyone did. He was the kind of man people talked about in whispers, powerful, untouchable, always in control. As he took his seat, the staff straightened instinctively. Even Mr. Kofi's voice softened when he greeted him. Dalal lowered her gaze and moved carefully, hoping to remain unnoticed. But something about nights like this, they never allowed that. "Table 5, Mr. Kofi called sharply. Dalal, you take it?" Her heart skipped once. "Yes, sir." She picked up her notepad and walked toward the table. Step by step, calm, controlled, invisible. That was the plan, until it wasn't. Because the moment she reached the table, Kwame Mensah looked up. And for the first time that day, Dalal Hassan was no longer invisible. Kwame Mensah had built his life on certainty. Certainty that money could solve anything. Certainty that power commanded respect. Certainty that people revealed their true worth the moment they believed no one important was watching. He sat at the center of the table like a man who had never doubted his place in the world. The restaurant bent itself subtly around him, staff moving faster, voices lowering, even the air feeling more controlled, as if it too understood who had arrived. Across from him, his friends leaned back in their chairs, relaxed in the comfort of shared status. They spoke in confident tones, switching easily between English and bits of French, laughing at stories that carried the weight of influence and privilege. Kwame listened, but only partially. His mind rarely stayed in one place for long. It was always calculating, measuring, observing. And then something shifted. A presence. He looked up just as Dalal Hassan reached the table. For a brief second, everything slowed. She stood straight, her posture calm, but not submissive. Her uniform was simple, worn at the edges, yet carefully arranged. There was no fear in her eyes, no nervous energy, no attempt to impress. Just stillness. Kwame noticed that first. Most people changed around him. Their voices tightened, their hands fidgeted, their smiles stretched too wide. But not her. "Good evening, Sir Dalal," said softly. "Welcome." Her voice was steady. Not overly polite, not cold, just balanced. Kwame's eyes narrowed slightly, not in anger, but in curiosity. Something about her didn't fit. "Do you know who this is?" One of the men at the table chuckled, nudging another guest as he glanced at Dalal. Dalal didn't answer. She simply held her notepad, waiting. "She probably doesn't," another added dismissively. Kwame raised a hand, silencing them without effort. "What's your name?" he asked. "Dalal, sir." He repeated it quietly, as if testing the sound. "Dalal." There was a pause. "Take our orders." The table spoke over each other, at first making requests in quick succession. Wine selections, appetizers, special dishes not even listed on the menu. Dalal listened carefully, writing each order with precision. Then one of the guests, a middle-aged man with a heavy accent, began speaking in French, his tone impatient. "Je veux quelque chose de spécial." "Pas que, vous comprenez. I want something special, not this. Do you understand?" One of the other waiters nearby hesitated, clearly unsure. Dalal didn't. "Oui, monsieur," she replied calmly. "Je peux vous recommander un plat que vous allez apprécier." "Yes, sir. I can recommend a dish you will enjoy." The man blinked, surprised. "Ah, d'accord." He leaned back, visibly more relaxed. A small silence followed. It was subtle, barely noticeable, but Kwame heard it. He leaned back slightly, his eyes now fixed on Dalal. "You speak French?" he asked. Dalal nodded once. "Yes, sir. Where did you learn a long time ago?" Kwame's lips curved slightly, not quite a smile. "That's not an answer." Dalal met his gaze for just a second longer than most people would dare. "It is enough, sir." A flicker of something crossed Kwame's face. Interest. One of the men at this table laughed lightly. "Maybe she memorized a few phrases," he said. "You know how it is." Another joined in. "Yes, these days everyone claims to be something." Dalal didn't react. She simply continued writing her pen, moving steadily across the page. Kwame watched her more closely now. Not the words she wrote, but the way she existed. Unbothered, grounded. It was unusual. "All right," Kwame said suddenly, his tone shifting. Dalal paused. He leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on the table. "Say something else." Dalal blinked. "Sir." "In French," he clarified. "Anything you want." There was a brief pause. Then Dalal spoke. Not just a sentence, but a fluid, natural explanation of the restaurant's specialties, her pronunciation smooth, her rhythm effortless. The table grew quiet. Even the man who had first spoken French tilted his head slightly, listening more carefully now. When she finished, he nodded slowly. "C'est correct," he said. "Très naturel." It's correct, very natural. A different kind of silence settled over the table now. Not loud, not dramatic, but present. Kwame tapped his fingers lightly against the table, his gaze never leaving Dalal. "Interesting," he murmured. Then, almost casually, "What else do you speak?" Dalal hesitated for just a moment. Then she answered. 8 languages, sir." The words hung in the air, and then laughter. It came quickly, loudly, almost reflexively. 8, one of the men repeated, shaking his head. "That's a good one." Another leaned forward, grinning. "Which 8? Let's hear them." Dalal remained still. "English, French, Arabic," she began calmly. "Oh, she's serious." Someone interrupted, laughing harder now. Kwame didn't laugh immediately. He watched, measured, studied. But then slowly, a smile appeared. Not warm, not kind. Amused. 8 languages, Kwame repeated, his voice now louder, carrying just enough to reach nearby tables. "You expect us to believe that Dalal said nothing." Around them, a few guests had begun to turn their heads. Conversation softened. Curiosity spread like quiet fire. Kwame leaned back in his chair, crossing one leg over the other. "You know," he said, glancing briefly at his friends, "people say many things when they want attention." More laughter. Phones began to lift, not openly, but subtly, angled, ready. Dalal could feel it, the shift, the weight of eyes, the beginning of something she had experienced too many times before. "Judgment. Tell me." Kwame continued, his voice smooth but edged with something sharper now. "Why are you still working here?" "If you're so talented," the question landed differently. Not like a joke, like a challenge. Dalal's fingers tightened slightly around her pen, but her face remained calm. "Because I need to work, sir." A simple answer. Too simple. Kwame tilted his head. "That's all?" "Yes, sir." Another pause. Then he smiled again, this time wider, more deliberate. "All right," Kwame said, his voice lifting just enough to draw full attention now. "If you truly speak 8 languages." He gestured lightly toward the table, then around the room. "Then prove it." The laughter returned louder, now encouraged. "Yes, prove it. Come on, entertain us. Let's see if it's real." Dalal stood still. The room felt different now, heavier, expectant. For a moment, nothing happened. And in that moment, something invisible balanced on a thin edge. Pride, dignity, survival. Dalal could walk away. She could refuse. But she knew how this world worked. Refusal would not protect her. It would only confirm what they already believed. Slowly, she placed her notepad down, lifted her head, and looked directly at Kwame Mensah. Not with anger, not with fear, but with something far more unsettling clarity. "Which language would you like first, sir?" she asked quietly. The laughter faltered. Just slightly, just enough. Kwame's smile paused, not disappearing, but shifting, because in that moment, for the first time, he realized something. This was no longer a joke, and whatever came next, he might not be the one in control. For a brief, suspended second, no one spoke. The laughter that had filled the table just moments ago seemed to hang in the air, uncertain now, as if it no longer knew where it belonged. A few of the men shifted in their seats, exchanging glances that carried both amusement and something else, curiosity, perhaps, or the first flicker of doubt. Kwame Mensah did not move. He studied Dalal with a sharper focus, now the kind he reserved for negotiations, for moments when something unexpected entered his carefully controlled world. "Which language?" he repeated slowly, as if tasting the question. Dalal did not lower her gaze. "Yes, sir." Her voice remained steady, but inside her heartbeat had begun to rise, not from fear, but from the weight of what this moment meant. Not just for her pride, but for everything she had fought to keep hidden. One of the men at the table leaned forward, a playful grin spreading across his face. "Arabic," he said. "Let's start with that." Another laughed. "Yes, let's see how far she goes." Kwame raised a hand slightly, not to stop them, but to quiet the growing noise. "Arabic," he confirmed, his eyes still locked on Dalal. "Go ahead." The room leaned in. Even those who pretended not to watch were listening now. Dalal took a small breath. Not deep, not dramatic, just enough. Then she spoke. "Lesam likam, smaidial, kaif yimkani, misdidkam laila." Her voice flowed naturally, the sounds soft yet precise, carrying a rhythm that felt lived in, not rehearsed. A man seated at a nearby table, older with silver at his temples, looked up sharply. He had been speaking quietly to his companion in Arabic moments before. Now his eyes widened slightly as he listened. Dalal continued, her sentences forming effortlessly, offering recommendations, describing dishes, even adjusting her tone to match the polite formalities of the language. When she finished, silence followed. Real silence this time. Not forced, not awkward. Just still. The older man gave a slow nod. Shai Jadan, he said quietly. Tibai. Very correct. Natural. A ripple passed through the room. It was subtle, like a shift in wind direction, but it was there. At Kwame's table, the laughter did not return. Not yet. One of the men cleared his throat. All right, he said, forcing a chuckle. Maybe she learned that one properly. Another leaned back. Yes, one language doesn't prove 8. Kwame's expression didn't change much, but his eyes had sharpened. Next, he said. French again, someone added quickly, almost eager to regain control of the situation. Dalal nodded once. She switched without hesitation. Mesdames et messieurs, permettez-moi de vous présenter notre spécialité du soir. Her tone was smooth, her pronunciation clean, her phrasing elegant in a way that could not be easily imitated. She wasn't just translating, she was speaking as someone who understood nuance, who had lived inside the language. The same French-speaking guest from earlier sat up straighter now. He listened more carefully this time. When she finished, he did not smile. He simply said, C'est impeccable. It's flawless. The shift grew heavier. No one laughed. Kwame leaned forward slightly, his fingers now still against the table. Continue, he said. Swahili? Another voice called out this time from a nearby table. Dalal turned her head slightly, acknowledging the speaker. Then she began again. Karibuni sana. Leo tuna sahani malum ambayo ningependekeza kwenu. Her voice carried a warmth that felt different from the previous languages, more grounded, more intimate. A young couple seated near the window exchanged surprised looks. She sounds like she's from East Africa, the woman whispered. The man nodded slowly. She's fluent. Now the room was fully engaged. Phones were no longer hidden. They were raised openly, not to mock, but to capture. Because something was happening, something unexpected. Kwame exhaled slowly. This was no longer entertainment. This was something else. But he wasn't ready to surrender control. Not yet. Yoruba, he said, his tone firm. A test, a real one. Dalal met his gaze. Then she spoke. Ekale, bawoni mo seleran yin lowo loni. The sound of the language carried weight, familiar, rooted, undeniable. One of the men at the table froze. He had been smiling just seconds before. Now his expression shifted. Wait, he muttered under his breath. That's... Dalal continued her sentences flowing with ease, her tone respectful but confident. When she finished, the man stared at her. That's not just basic, he said quietly. That's fluent. A crack had formed. Not in Dalal. In them. Kwame's jaw tightened slightly. For the first time, something close to discomfort flickered beneath his composed exterior. But still he pushed forward. Igbo, he said. Dalal did not hesitate. Ndewo, kedukam gaesi nyere unu akataa. Her voice shifted again, subtle, precise, accurate. Another confirmation came from across the room. A man stood slightly from his seat, shaking his head in disbelief. She's not faking this, he said. Now the silence had weight. It pressed down on the room, on the table, on Kwame. But he wasn't finished. English? He said suddenly, almost sharply. Dalal blinked once, then answered. Of course, sir. Her tone returned to its original calm, but now it carried something more. Not defiance, not pride, just truth. Kwame leaned back slowly. The room waited. He could feel it. The expectation, the shift, the loss of control. How he asked, finally. Not loud this time, not mocking, just one word. Heavy. Dalal looked at him. Really looked at him. And for the first time since she had approached the table, something in her expression changed. Not weakness, not fear, but something deeper, a quiet, unspoken history. I listened, she said softly. The answer seemed too simple, too small, but it wasn't. Kwame frowned slightly. That's not enough. Dalal didn't argue. She simply held his gaze. Sometimes she said it has to be. No one spoke, because in that moment the performance had ended, and something real had taken its place. Kwame looked away first. A small movement, barely noticeable, but undeniable. Around them the room began to breathe again. Conversations returned soft at first, then stronger. But the energy had changed. It would not go back. Dalal reached for her notepad. Would you like to complete your order? Sir, she asked calmly, as if nothing had happened, as if everything had. Kwame looked at her. Longer this time. Then slowly he nodded. But inside him, something had already begun to break. The restaurant did not return to what it had been. It tried. Voices rose again, glasses clinked, waiters resumed their movement, but something invisible had shifted beneath it all. The laughter that once felt effortless now carried hesitation. Conversations paused more often, eyes drifting back toward Table 5, toward Dalal, and toward the man who had tried to turn her into a spectacle. Kwame Mensah sat still long after she finished speaking. The others at his table shifted, uncertain now how to behave. The ease they had walked in with, the casual superiority, the quiet certainty had cracked, not shattered, but cracked enough to be noticed. One of them cleared his throat. Well, he said, forcing a small smile that was impressive. Another nodded quickly. Yes? Unexpected. But the tone was wrong. It wasn't admiration, it was recovery. Kwame didn't respond. His fingers rested against the table, unmoving, his eyes fixed on Dalal as she wrote down the last of their orders. There was no trace of performance left in her now. No need to prove anything further. She had already done that. Dalal? He said suddenly. She paused, pen hovering above the page. Yes, sir. For a brief moment he said nothing, as if he was searching for the right words, or perhaps for control. Where did you learn all that, he asked. The question was quieter than before. Less for the room, more for himself. Dalal finished writing and closed her notepad gently. I told you, sir, she replied. A long time ago. Kwame exhaled slowly. That still doesn't explain it. Dalal looked at him not with defiance, but with a kind of calm distance. Not everything needs to be explained, she said. A faint ripple of reaction moved through the nearby tables. Not laughter, something closer to respect. Kwame leaned back in his chair, studying her again. This time there was no mockery in his eyes, only thought. You don't belong here, one of the men at the table said suddenly, his voice lower, now less certain than before. Dalal turned slightly toward him. I work here, she answered. That's not what I meant. He hesitated, then added, someone like you. You shouldn't be serving people like us. The words hung awkwardly. They were meant to sound like a compliment. But they weren't. Dalal didn't smile. Someone has to, she said simply. The man opened his mouth to respond, then closed it again, because there was nothing to argue with. Kwame watched this exchange carefully. He recognized the shift not just in the room, but inside himself. It was unfamiliar, uncomfortable. For years he had built his identity on knowing where people stood, who had power, who didn't, who mattered, who didn't. And now a waitress stood in front of him, quietly dismantling that structure without raising her voice. Bring the wine, he said finally. Dalal nodded. Yes, sir. As she turned to leave, something unexpected happened. Kwame spoke again. Wait. She stopped, looked back, for the first time since she had approached the table. He hesitated, not visibly, not enough for most people to notice, but it was there. A pause, a break in rhythm. Thank you, he said. The words felt unfamiliar in his mouth, almost misplaced, Dalal held his gaze for a moment. Then she nodded once. "You're welcome, sir." And she walked away. The table remained quiet for several seconds after she left. "Then you thanked her," one of the men said, raising an eyebrow. Kwame didn't look at him. "She did her job," he replied. "That's not why you said it." Kwame didn't answer. Across the room, Dalal moved with the same steady pace as before, carrying trays, speaking softly with other guests, blending back into the rhythm of the restaurant. But it wasn't the same. It couldn't be. Because now people saw her. At another table, a woman leaned toward her companion. "That girl," she whispered. "Did you hear her?" Her companion nodded slowly. "She's not ordinary." Near the bar, two waiters exchanged glances. "I didn't know she could do that," one muttered. "You didn't ask," the other replied. Even Mr. Kofi Adu, standing near the entrance, had noticed. His eyes followed Dalal now with a different kind of attention. Not respect, not yet, but something close to calculation. Back at table 5, the wine arrived. Dalal placed the glasses carefully, pouring with practiced precision. No one interrupted her this time. No one laughed. Kwame watched her hands, steady, controlled, unshaken. "Dalal," he said again. She looked up. "Yes, sir. Do you plan to stay here?" he asked. The question seemed simple, but it wasn't. Dalal paused for a fraction of a second, then answered, "For now." Kwame frowned slightly. "That's not a plan." "It's enough," she said. He leaned forward. "You could do more." The words came out before he fully considered them. Dalal didn't respond immediately. She finished pouring the last glass, set the bottle down, and straightened. Then she met his eyes. "Doing more," she said quietly, "requires more than just ability." Kwame held her gaze. "And what does it require?" Dalal hesitated. Not because she didn't have an answer, but because she knew the cost of saying it. "Opportunity," she said finally. The word settled between them. Heavy, unavoidable. Kwame leaned back slowly. For the first time that evening, he didn't have a response. Dalal gave a small nod. "Is there anything else, sir?" He shook his head. "No. Enjoy your evening." And with that, she stepped away again. But this time something followed her. Not attention, not curiosity. Something deeper. Respect. At the table, no one spoke for a while. Not because they didn't have words, but because none of them felt right. Kwame lifted his glass, staring at the deep red wine inside. He thought about what she had said. Opportunity? Such a simple word. Such an easy thing for someone like him. And yet for her, it was everything. He took a slow sip. The taste didn't register, because his mind was elsewhere. On a waitress. On a moment. On something that had quietly, unexpectedly shifted. And for the first time in a long time, Kwame Mensah was not thinking about business. He was thinking about a question, one he couldn't ignore anymore. What else had he been wrong about? Across the room, Dalal continued working. But inside her, something had shifted too. Because for the first time, she had not just endured. She had been seen. And that was only the beginning. That night did not end when the restaurant closed. For Dalal, it followed her home. The streets of Accra were quieter now, but never truly silent. The hum of distant traffic blended with voices from roadside stalls, music leaking softly from passing cars, and the occasional bark of a stray dog. Dalal walked quickly, her worn shoes tapping lightly against the uneven pavement, her mind still carrying the weight of the evening. She kept replaying it, the laughter, the challenge, the silence that followed, and then his voice. "Thank you." It had been simple, almost insignificant, but it stayed with her. By the time she reached home, the sky had deepened into night. The small room felt warmer than usual, the air thick with stillness. Yasin was awake, sitting cross-legged on the floor with a small book in his hands. The dim light flickered above him, casting long shadows across the walls. He looked up the moment she entered. "You're late," he said, his voice soft but filled with quiet concern. Dalal forced a small smile. It was busy. She set her bag down and reached into it, pulling out a neatly wrapped portion of food. I brought something. Yasin's eyes lit up not with excitement but with relief. He took the food carefully, as if it might disappear if he moved too quickly. Did you eat? He asked. Dalal nodded. Yes. It was a lie. They ate together in silence. Not uncomfortable silence, just the kind that came from understanding without needing words. After a few minutes, Yasin spoke again. You look different. Dalal glanced at him. How? He hesitated, searching for the right word. Like something happened. Dalal exhaled slowly. Something did. She didn't tell him everything. Not about the laughter. Not about the way the room had turned into a stage. But she told him enough. About the languages. About the moment things changed. About the silence. Yasin listened carefully, his eyes never leaving her face. When she finished, he leaned back slightly. I knew it, he said. Dalal frowned lightly, knew what that one day someone would see. Dalal looked away. It doesn't change anything, she said quietly. Yasin shook his head. It does. How? Because now they can't pretend you're nothing. The words settled deeper than she expected. Dalal didn't respond, because part of her wanted to believe him, and part of her knew how the world worked. Being seen didn't always mean being valued. Later that night, after Yasin had fallen asleep, Dalal sat alone by the window. The city lights flickered in the distance, soft and far away. She opened her notebook. The same worn pages, the same careful handwriting. But tonight, they felt different. Her fingers traced a line of Arabic script, then French, then a phrase in Swahili she had practiced years ago. Each word carried a memory, a place, a moment in time when she had believed something more was possible. Her father's voice echoed faintly in her mind. Language is not just words, Dalal, he used to say. It is doors. Each one leads somewhere new. She had believed him, still did. But doors required more than knowledge. They required access. Dalal closed the notebook slowly. And for the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to wonder. What if tonight meant something? Morning came too quickly. The restaurant was already buzzing when Dalal arrived. But something was different. She felt it immediately. The looks, the whispers, the way conversations paused when she passed. Abena stood near the counter, arms crossed. Well, she said, as Dalal approached, the star has arrived. Dalal said nothing. She tied her apron, her movements calm. I saw the videos another waitress added. Everyone has. Dalal's hand paused for a fraction of a second. Videos. Abena laughed lightly. Oh, you didn't know? She pulled out her phone, tapping the screen before turning it toward Dalal. There you are. Dalal looked, and there she was, standing at table 5, speaking, calm, clear, unshaken, captured from multiple angles, shared, watched. Her chest tightened slightly, not from fear, but from something harder to name, exposure. They're saying you're some kind of genius, the other waitress said. Or a fraud, Abena added quickly. Depends who you ask. Dalal handed the phone back without a word. She didn't deny it, didn't defend herself, didn't explain, because she had learned something important a long time ago. Once people decided who you were, the truth rarely changed their minds. Enough, Mr. Kofi Adu's voice cut through the chatter. He stood near the entrance, watching them with narrowed eyes. This is a workplace, not a market. It's not a... The others scattered quickly. Dalal remained where she was. Dalal, he said sharply. Yes, sir. He walked toward her slowly, studying her, measuring. You caused quite a scene last night, he said. I did my job, sir. He stopped in front of her. Your job is to serve, not to perform. Dalal held his gaze. I didn't choose it to be a performance. A brief silence. Mr. Kofi exhaled through his nose. Be careful, he said quietly. Attention can be dangerous. Dalal nodded. Yes, sir. But as she walked away, his words lingered. Attention, danger. She understood both, more than he realized. The day moved forward. Orders, tables, voices. The same rhythm as always, but not the same world. Because now people looked at her differently. Some with curiosity, some with suspicion, some with something close to admiration. And somewhere in the city, Kwame Mensah was watching too. Not the videos, not the reactions, but the memory of a moment he couldn't explain. A waitress, standing in front of him, speaking truths he wasn't ready to hear, and a single word that refused to leave his mind. Opportunity. By midday, he made a decision. Not fully formed, not fully understood, but undeniable. He needed to see her again, not as entertainment, not as a challenge, but as something else, something he had not yet defined. And for the first time, Kwame Mensah was stepping into a situation where he did not control the outcome. And that was exactly what made it impossible to ignore. The rest of the day moved forward, but nothing truly felt the same. Dalal continued her work, as she always did, measured steps, quiet presence, precise attention to every detail. She carried trays, took orders, and responded to customers with the same calm professionalism. Yet beneath that surface something had shifted, not only in how others saw her, but in how she moved through the space. People no longer ignored her. Some watched her with curiosity, whispering when they thought she could not hear. Others tested her subtly switching languages mid-sentence, as if trying to confirm what they had seen in the videos. A few spoke to her with a new kind of politeness, one that felt less like respect and more like uncertainty. Dalal responded to all of it the same way, quietly, without reaction, because attention, she knew, was never neutral. It could lift you, or it could break you. And sometimes it did, both at once. By late afternoon, the restaurant manager, Mr. Kofi Adu, had become noticeably more attentive to her movements. Not openly hostile, not openly supportive, just observant in a way that made Dalal aware she was being measured differently now. When her shift ended, she expected the day to finally release her. It didn't. Dalal, a voice called from behind. She turned. One of the junior staff stood near the entrance, slightly out of breath. There's someone asking for you. Dalal frowned slightly. Who? He didn't say, but he's not a regular. Something in the way he said it made her pause. She glanced toward the front of the restaurant. And there he was, Kwame Mensah, standing alone this time. No group, no laughter, no performance. Just him. Dalal felt a brief tightening in her chest, not fear, but a recognition that this moment would not be simple. She walked toward him, each step controlled. Good evening, sir, she said. Kwame nodded slightly. Dalal. He said her name differently now. Slower, more deliberate. There was a brief silence. Then he spoke. I wanted to talk. Dalal held his gaze. About what Kwame exhaled lightly, as if choosing his words more carefully than he was used to. Yesterday, he said. What happened? Dalal's expression did not change. You mean when you asked me to entertain your table? The words were not sharp, but they were precise. Kwame did not flinch, though something in his eyes shifted. Yes, he said. That. Another pause. I misjudged you. Dalal said nothing, not because she didn't hear him, but because she was waiting. Kwame noticed. I spoke without understanding, he continued, and I treated you like you were less than you are. Dalal studied him quietly. This was not the same man from the night before. His voice was lower, his posture less rigid. But apology, she knew, was not just about words. It was about truth. And now you understand, she asked. Kwame hesitated. Not fully, he admitted, but more than I did. Dalal crossed her arms lightly, not defensive, but grounded. What changed? She asked. Kwame glanced away for a moment, then back at her. You didn't react the way I expected, he said. And what did you expect? That you would be intimidated? Or that you would try to impress me? Dalal let out a small breath. I did neither, I know. Another pause settled between them, quieter this time, less tense, but still unfinished. Kwame spoke again. I've been thinking about what you said. Dalal tilted her head slightly. Which part opportunity? The word landed again, carrying the same weight as before. Dalal's expression softened just slightly, not in agreement, but in recognition, and she asked. Kwame took a step closer, not enough to invade her space, but enough to make his intent clear. You're wasting your ability here. Dalal's gaze sharpened. Working is not wasting, she said. That's not what I meant. It sounded like it. Kwame paused, then adjusted his tone. You have something rare, he said, and you're using it in a place that doesn't value it. Dalal looked at him steadily. And you think you do? Kwame did not answer immediately. Instead, he reached into his jacket and pulled out a business card. My company works with international partners, he said. We need people who can bridge languages, cultures, and negotiations. He extended the card toward her. I can give you that opportunity. Dalal did not take it. Not yet. And what would that make me? She asked. Kwame frowned slightly. An employee. No, Dalal said quietly. Something else. Kwame's brow tightened. Explain. Dalal's voice remained calm, but there was something deeper beneath it now. Someone you discovered, she said. Someone you helped. Someone who owes you. Kwame straightened slightly. That's not what I'm offering. It's what it becomes, Dalal replied. The words were not angry, but they were honest. Kwame studied her again more carefully this time. You think I'm trying to control you? Dalal didn't hesitate. Yes. A long silence followed, not uncomfortable, but heavy. Kwame lowered his hand slowly, the business card still between his fingers. I'm trying to fix a mistake, he said. Dalal shook her head gently. Mistakes are not fixed by replacing one imbalance with another. Kwame's jaw tightened slightly. This is not an imbalance. Dalal met his gaze. It is, she said. Because you choose when to give. And I have no choice but to receive. The truth in her words settled between them, undeniable. Kwame had no immediate response. For perhaps the first time in a very long time he was being spoken to without fear, without calculation, without the need to please. And it forced him to confront something unfamiliar. Limit. Dalal took a small step back. I appreciate what you're trying to do, she said, but I don't need to be saved. Kwame looked at her, something unreadable passing through his expression. Everyone needs help sometimes. Yes, Dalal agreed, but not everyone needs to be owned. The word landed sharply. Kwame inhaled slowly. That's not what I want. Dalal's voice softened slightly, though her stance did not change. Then you need to understand the difference. Another silence. This one longer. More reflective. Kwame looked at the card in his hand, then back at her. For a moment it seemed like he might insist, but he didn't. Instead, he slipped the card back into his pocket. I don't know that difference yet, he said quietly. Dalal nodded. I know. There was no judgment in her tone, only truth. Kwame stepped back slightly. Then teach me, he said. Dalal's expression shifted just a little. Surprise. Not because of the words themselves, but because of how they were said, without authority, without expectation. Just request. She studied him for a long moment. Then she spoke. That's not something you ask for, she said. It's something you learn. Kwame held her gaze. And if I'm willing to learn, Dalal paused, then answered. Then start by listening. The same word again. Simple, but not easy. Kwame nodded slowly. I will. Dalal inclined her head slightly. Good. She turned ready to leave, but before she could take more than a step, Kwame spoke again. Dalal. She stopped, but did not turn immediately. Yes. There was a brief hesitation in his voice this time. Will I see you again? Dalal looked back over her shoulder. Her expression was calm, uncertain, but not closed. You just did, she said. Then she walked away, leaving Kwame Mensah standing in a place he had never been before, without control, without certainty, and for the first time in his life, willing to learn. The next few days did not bring peace. If anything, they brought pressure. Dalal arrived at the restaurant each morning with the same quiet discipline, but the environment around her had grown heavier, more complicated. The attention that followed the viral videos had not faded. Instead, it had settled into something more persistent, more intrusive. Customers recognized her now. Some greeted her with admiration, asking her to repeat what they had seen online, as if her skill were a performance they had paid to witness. Others tested her deliberately, switching languages mid-conversation, smiling as if waiting for her to fail. A few simply stared their curiosity unfiltered. Dalal responded to all of them the same way, calm, respectful professional, but inside the strain was beginning to show. Because this was not opportunity, it was exposure without protection, and exposure, she knew, came with a cost. Mr. Kofiadu made that cost clear by the end of the week. Dalal, he called from the front office, his tone sharp but controlled. Come here. She stepped inside, closing the door behind her. He did not offer her a seat. You've become very popular, he said, leaning back in his chair. Dalal said nothing. That kind of attention is good for business, he continued. People come here now hoping to see you, to hear you. She understood immediately where this was going. I am here to serve, she replied. Mr. Kofi nodded slowly. Exactly. And you will continue to serve. But now, you will do a little more. Dalal's gaze remained steady. What do you mean, sir? He leaned forward slightly, folding his hands. When guests ask, you will speak. Demonstrate, engage. Make their experience memorable. Dalal felt a quiet tightening in her chest. That is not part of my job description. Mr. Kofi's expression hardened just slightly. It is now. A brief silence followed. Dalal chose her words carefully. Will I be compensated for this additional responsibility? The question was simple, but it changed the air in the room. Mr. Kofi let out a short, humorless laugh. You are already compensated, he said. Better than many in your position. That is not an answer, Dalal replied quietly. His eyes narrowed. You are in no position to negotiate. Dalal held his gaze. Then I will continue doing the job I was hired for, she said. The calm in her voice was not defiance, it was clarity. Mr. Kofi studied her for a long moment, then leaned back again. You should be careful, he said softly. Opportunities don't come twice. Dalal did not respond. Because she had already learned something important. Not every opportunity was worth accepting. She left the office without another word, but the consequences began almost immediately. Her schedule changed. Longer hours, fewer breaks, more demanding sections of the restaurant. It was not punishment that could be named, but it was punishment all the same. Her coworkers noticed. Some watched with quiet sympathy, others with satisfaction. Abena approached her near the service counter later that afternoon. You should have just done what he asked, she said, lowering her voice. Dalal continued arranging the trays. And what would that change, she asked. It would make things easier. For him, Dalal replied. Abena frowned. For you too? Dalal shook her head slightly. Easy is not always right. Abena sighed, clearly unconvinced. You're going to make this harder than it needs to be. Dalal didn't argue. because she knew something Abena didn't. Some things were already hard. They didn't need to be made harder. They needed to be endured. The evening shift arrived with its usual intensity, but the atmosphere felt sharper, now more watchful. At one table, a group of young professionals called her over. "You're the one from the video, right?" one of them asked, smiling. Dalal nodded once. "Yes." "Can you say something in German?" another added quickly. Dalal paused for a fraction of a second. Then she answered in fluent, measured German, explaining the evening's menu. They clapped, lightly impressed. "That's incredible," one said. "How did you learn all that?" Dalal gave the same answer she always did. I listened. They laughed, thinking it was a joke. She didn't correct them, because the truth rarely sounded believable. At another table, a businessman switched between English and French mid-sentence, watching her carefully. Dalal followed effortlessly, responding in both languages without hesitation. He leaned back, nodding slowly. "Impressive," he said. "Very impressive." But even in his praise there was distance, as if he were observing a skill, not a person. By the end of the night, Dalal's feet ached, her shoulders heavy with fatigue, but she kept moving, because stopping was not an option. When her shift finally ended, she stepped outside into the cool night air, drawing in a slow breath. For a moment, she allowed herself to feel the exhaustion. Then she straightened, because there was still more waiting for her at home. Yasin. Responsibility did not end when the shift did. As she began walking, she noticed a car parked across the street. Dark, unfamiliar. She slowed slightly. Then the window rolled down. "Dalal." She stopped, turned. Kwame Mensah stepped out of the car. This time there was no hesitation in his approach. "I've been waiting," he said. Dalal looked at him, her expression unreadable. "For what?" "For a chance to speak again." Dalal exhaled softly. "We already spoke." "Not enough." She studied him for a moment. There was something different in him now. Not just curiosity, persistence. Why, she asked. Kwame didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked at her, not at her uniform, not at her posture, but at her. "Because I realized something," he said finally. Dalal waited. "That night wasn't about languages," he continued. "It was about something I don't understand yet." Dalal crossed her arms lightly. "And you think I can explain it to you?" "I think you already have," he said. "I just didn't listen properly." The honesty in his voice caught her off guard, not because it was dramatic, but because it was simple, unforced. She looked away briefly, then back at him. "I'm tired," she said. Kwame nodded. "I can see that." "Then why are you here?" He held her gaze. "Because I don't want to get this wrong again." The words settled between them. Dalal considered them carefully. Then she asked, "And what is this?" Kwame exhaled slowly. "Understanding you." Dalal shook her head slightly. "That's not something you achieve in one conversation." "I know. Or two. I know." "Then what are you asking?" Kwame hesitated, then answered. "For time." Dalal's expression shifted just slightly. "Time for what?" "To learn," he said, without assuming, without deciding who you are before you speak. Dalal studied him for a long moment. The street around them remained quiet, the city's distant sounds filling the silence between their words. Finally, she spoke. "Learning requires patience," she said. Kwame nodded. "I have that. Learning also requires humility." Another pause. "I'm working on that," he admitted. Dalal looked at him, really looked this time. And for the first time since he had stepped out of the car, she didn't see a billionaire. She saw a man trying. Not perfectly, not completely, but genuinely. She turned slightly, preparing to continue her walk. If you're serious, she said, then start by understanding this. Kwame waited. I am not a project, she continued, and I am not a lesson. Kwame nodded slowly. I understand. Dalal glanced back at him. No, she said quietly. You're beginning to. Then she walked away. And this time Kwame didn't follow. He stood where he was watching her disappear into the night. Not frustrated, not defeated, but changed. Because for the first time he wasn't chasing control. He was learning to wait. The city moved as it always did. Restless, layered, full of quiet stories hidden behind loud surfaces. But for Kwame Mensah, something had shifted beneath that rhythm. Something that would not settle, no matter how much he tried to return to his usual routine. At his office high above the city, the glass walls reflected a version of him that had always been certain. Meetings began on time, decisions were made quickly, and people listened when he spoke. It was a world built on structure where every question had an answer, and every answer could be turned into strategy. But lately, that certainty had started to crack. Sir, his assistant, Ama Serwa, said gently, placing a file on his desk. The delegation from Nairobi is waiting. Kwame nodded without looking up. I'll be there. Ama hesitated for a moment before leaving. She had worked with him long enough to recognize when his attention was elsewhere, and today it clearly was. The numbers on the screen in front of him blurred slightly, as his thoughts returned uninvited to the same place they had gone every day since that night. Dalal Hassan. It irritated him, not because she had proven him wrong, but because she had done something far more unsettling. She had shown him a gap in his understanding of the world, a space he had never needed to confront before. He closed the file in front of him and stood. The meeting could wait. Understanding could not. Later that afternoon, Kwame sat across from a man he trusted more than most, his longtime advisor, Kojo Bediako. Kojo was older, quieter, the kind of man who spoke less but saw more. You're distracted, Kojo said simply, pouring tea into 2 small cups. Kwame gave a short breath of amusement. That obvious Kojo slid 1 cup toward him. You don't ignore meetings unless something is bothering you. Kwame took the cup, his fingers resting against the warmth. It's not business, he said. Kojo raised an eyebrow slightly. That narrows it down. Kwame leaned back in his chair, his gaze drifting toward the window. It's a person. Kojo did not react immediately. Someone important. Kwame paused. I don't know yet. Kojo considered that. And that bothers you? Kwame gave a small nod. Yes. There was no shame in admitting it. Not here. Kojo sipped his tea. Tell me. Kwame spoke more slowly than usual, choosing his words carefully, not out of caution but out of unfamiliarity. He described the night at the restaurant, the moment that had started as amusement, and ended in something he could not easily define. He spoke about Dalal, her calm, her refusal to be reduced, her insistence on being seen as she was not as he interpreted her to be. Kojo listened without interruption. When Kwame finished, the older man set his cup down gently. And what do you want? Kojo asked. Kwame frowned slightly. That's the problem, he admitted. I don't know. Kojo nodded. Then let me ask you something else. Kwame waited. Why does it matter? The question was simple, but it landed with weight. Kwame leaned forward slightly, his elbows resting on his knees. Because she challenged something I believed, he said, and now you're questioning that belief. Yes. Kojo studied him for a moment. That's not a problem, he said. That's growth. Kwame exhaled softly. It doesn't feel like it. Kojo allowed himself a faint smile. Growth rarely does. Silence settled between them for a moment, comfortable but thoughtful. Then Kojo spoke again. You said you tried to help her. Kwame nodded. She refused. Kojo's expression didn't change. Of course she did. Kwame looked at him. You're not surprised? Kojo shook his head. Not at all. Why? Kojo leaned back slightly. Because people like her don't want to be saved, he said. They want to be respected. Kwame's gaze sharpened. I offered her opportunity. Kojo nodded. On your terms. The words were not harsh, but they were precise. Kwame looked down at his hands, considering that. I thought I was doing the right thing. Kojo gave a small shrug. You probably were, from your perspective. And from hers, Kojo met his eyes. From hers, you were trying to decide her path before she had the chance to choose it. Kwame sat back slowly. The truth of that settled uncomfortably. So what am I supposed to do? He asked. Kojo didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached for the teapot and poured more into Kwame's cup. Then he spoke. Nothing. Kwame frowned. That's not helpful. Kojo smiled slightly. It's not supposed to be. Kwame shook his head. I can't just walk away. Why not? Kwame hesitated. Because walking away would mean accepting that this was not his to control, and that was something he had never been good at. Kojo watched him carefully. You want to understand her, he said. But understanding doesn't come from action. It comes from observation. From patience. Kwame exhaled. She told me something similar. Kojo nodded. Then perhaps you should listen. Later that evening, Kwame sat alone in his office, the city lights stretching endlessly beyond the glass. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to do something unfamiliar. Nothing. No calls, no decisions, no movement, just thought. He replayed every conversation he had had with Dalal, every word, every pause, every look. Not as a strategist analyzing a situation, but as a man trying to understand something he had never needed to understand before. Respect, not the kind that came with power, but the kind that existed without it. Meanwhile, across the city, Dalal's world was moving in a very different direction. At the small clinic near their neighborhood, she sat beside Yasin, her hands folded tightly in her lap as she waited. The doctor's voice from earlier still echoed in her mind. It's not severe yet, he had said, but it needs attention. Regular treatment, medication. Dalal had nodded, her expression calm. But inside, the numbers had already begun to calculate. Cost, time, possibility. Yasin looked up at her from the narrow bed. Are we okay? He asked quietly. Dalal forced a small smile. Yes. He studied her for a moment. You always say that. Dalal reached out, brushing a hand lightly against his hair. Because we always are. It was another lie, but it was one she chose to carry. That night as she walked home, the weight of everything pressed in on her more heavily than before. The attention, the pressure at work, the uncertainty. And now, the reality of what Yasin needed. She stopped for a moment beneath a flickering streetlight, her breath slow-controlled. For a brief second, the thought crossed her mind. Kwame's offer. Opportunity. Help. She closed her eyes, then shook her head. No, not like that. Dalal opened her eyes again and continued walking. Because no matter how difficult the path became, it had to be hers. And somewhere across the city, Kwame Mensah was beginning to understand something important. That not every problem could be solved with power, and not every person wanted to be saved. But understanding that truth was only the beginning. The following week tested Dalal in ways she had not anticipated. It began quietly, almost subtly, as if the pressure she had been carrying had decided to take a more deliberate form. The restaurant grew busier than usual, and with that increase came higher expectations, tighter schedules, and fewer allowances for rest. Mr. Kofi Adu said little, but his decisions spoke clearly. Dalal was assigned to the most demanding sections expected to handle difficult customers, and watched more closely than anyone else. It was not punishment anyone could prove, but it was punishment she could feel. Dalal accepted it without protest, Not because she agreed, but because she understood that resistance in this place would not change the outcome. Instead, she moved with even greater precision, guarding her energy, conserving her strength for what truly mattered. Yasin. Every decision now circled back to him. The medication the doctor had prescribed was not optional, it was necessary. And necessary things required money Dalal did not yet have. Each night she counted what she earned, subtracting expenses in her mind before the coins had even settled in her hand. Rent, food, transport, now medicine. The numbers did not balance. They never had. But now the gap felt sharper, more urgent. At the restaurant, the attention surrounding Dalal had evolved again. Where once there had been curiosity, now there was expectation. Customers came not just to dine, but to witness. Some asked for her directly, requesting that she serve their table. Others tested her more openly, speaking in unfamiliar languages, or challenging her with obscure phrases, eager to confirm what they had seen online. Dalal responded with the same calm control she always had, but the emotional cost of maintaining that composure began to accumulate. She was no longer just doing her job. She was performing a version of herself that others demanded, a version that left little room for exhaustion, for weakness, for truth. One evening, as she moved between tables, a group of corporate guests called her over. "You're the one who speaks 8 languages," one of them said, smiling with a hint of entitlement. Dalal nodded once. "Yes, good," he replied. "Then sit for a moment. We have a question." Dalal remained standing. "I'm working, sir." The man waved a hand dismissively. "It will only take a minute." Dalal did not move. A brief silence followed. Then she said, "If you need assistance with your order, I will help. Otherwise, I need to continue serving." The man's smile faded slightly. "You think you're too important now?" Dalal met his gaze. "No," she said. "I think I am doing my job." The tension at the table shifted. Not explosive, but present. Another guest leaned forward, studying her more carefully. "Let her go," he said quietly. "She's right." The first man leaned back, clearly irritated, but he said nothing more. Dalal inclined her head slightly and walked away. Later that night, Mr. Kofi called her into his office again. "You are becoming difficult," he said, his voice controlled but edged. Dalal stood calmly. "I am doing what I was hired to do. You are refusing customers. I am refusing to be used for entertainment." The words were spoken without anger, but they landed firmly. Mr. Kofi's expression hardened. "This attention is bringing business," he said. "You should be grateful." Dalal held his gaze. "I am grateful for my work," she replied, "but I will not turn it into something else without agreement." Mr. Kofi leaned forward. "You don't make agreements here." Dalal did not respond immediately, because she understood what he meant, and what it implied. "Then I will continue as I have been," she said finally. The silence that followed was heavier than before. Mr. Kofi studied her for a long moment, then leaned back. "You're making this harder for yourself," he said. Dalal nodded slightly. "I know." She turned and left the office. Her steps steady, her expression unchanged. But inside, the pressure tightened, because she could feel the limit approaching. Outside the restaurant, the night air felt cooler, but it did not ease the weight she carried. Dalal walked slowly, her mind moving through calculations, possibilities, outcomes. She had already taken on extra shifts where she could. She had reduced her own meals to ensure Yasin had enough. She had delayed payments where possible, stretching time as far as it would go. But time, she knew, was not something she could control forever. As she reached the edge of her street, she paused, her eyes lifting toward the dim light of their window. For a moment she allowed herself to feel the exhaustion fully, not just physical, but emotional, the kind that settled deep and stayed. Inside, Yasin sat on the floor, a small book open in front of him. "You're late," he said softly. Dalal smiled faintly. "I know." She set her bag down and knelt beside him. "How are you feeling?" Yasin shrugged. "Okay." She studied him carefully. Children often said they were okay, even when they weren't. Dalal reached out, placing a hand lightly against his forehead. His temperature felt normal, but she knew that wasn't enough. "Did you take the medicine?" she asked. Yasin nodded. "Yes." Dalal exhaled quietly, relief mixing with concern. The medicine would not last long. That night after Yasin had fallen asleep, Dalal sat alone again, her notebook open, but untouched. Her mind was not on words. It was on choices. For the first time, she allowed herself to revisit something she had pushed away. Kwame, his offer, his persistence. She did not trust it. Not fully, because she had seen how quickly power could shift from generosity to control. But she also could not ignore the reality in front of her. Yasin needed care, and care required resources she did not have. Dalal closed the notebook slowly. She did not decide anything that night, but the question no longer felt distant. It was close now, unavoidable. Across the city, Kwame Mensah stood in his office looking out over the same skyline. But his thoughts were not on business. They were on Dalal, on the way she had refused him, on the way she had stood her ground without anger, on the way she had made him see something he had never been forced to see before. Limit. Not his. Hers. He thought about Kojo's words. Do nothing. It had felt wrong at first, passive, ineffective. But now he began to understand. Doing nothing did not mean indifference. It meant restraint. It meant allowing space. Still, he could not ignore what he now knew. Dalal was not just strong. She was struggling. He had seen it in the details. The worn uniform, the careful way she managed every movement, the quiet exhaustion behind her composure. Kwame exhaled slowly. He did not want to interfere, but he also could not pretend he had not seen. For the first time in his life, he faced a decision that could not be solved with certainty, only with intention. And somewhere between restraint and action, he would have to find a way forward. Because this time, getting it wrong was not an option. The line between strength and breaking is rarely visible from the outside. Dalal had walked that line for years, balancing responsibility, dignity, and survival with a quiet resilience that few people ever noticed. But now the distance between those 2 points, strength and breaking, had begun to narrow. And for the first time, she could feel it. Yasin's condition did not worsen dramatically. It did something more dangerous. It lingered, the kind of illness that did not demand immediate panic but quietly insisted on consistent care. Medication checkups, proper nutrition, small things that together formed a cost Dalal could no longer ignore. At the clinic, the doctor spoke gently but clearly. "He needs stability," she said. "Not just treatment, routine, proper meals, less stress." Dalal nodded, her expression calm. Inside, the calculations returned. Routine required time. Time required flexibility. Flexibility required resources. And resources she did not have. Back at the restaurant, the pressure had not eased. If anything, it had become more refined. Mr. Kofi Adu no longer confronted her directly. Instead, he adjusted everything around her. Her shifts, her sections, the expectations placed on her. Dalal was now positioned where the most attention gathered, where the most demanding customers sat, where the smallest mistake could be noticed. It was strategic, subtle, effective. Dalal understood it for what it was. Not punishment meant to break her quickly, but pressure meant to wear her down over time. One evening, as she carried a tray across the dining floor, a sudden wave of dizziness passed through her. It was brief, almost imperceptible, but it forced her to stop for just a second. No one noticed, or at least no one said anything. Dalal steadied herself, adjusted her grip, and continued walking, because stopping was not an option. At table 7, A woman looked up as Dalal approached. "You're the girl from the video," she said, her tone softer than most. Dalal nodded once. "Yes." The woman studied her carefully. "You look tired." Dalal placed the glasses down gently. "I'm fine." The woman didn't press further, but her eyes lingered a moment longer than necessary. By the time the shift ended, Dalal's body felt heavier than usual, her steps slower, her breath slightly uneven, but she kept moving, because there was still somewhere she needed to be. At home, Yasin was waiting. He always was. "How was work?" he asked as she entered. Dalal smiled faintly. "Busy." Yasin nodded as if that explained everything. Sometimes it did. They ate quietly that night, the small meal divided carefully between them. Dalal made sure Yasin had the larger portion. She always did. Later, as Yasin prepared to sleep, he looked at her with a seriousness that did not belong to his age. "Are we going to be okay?" he asked. Dalal paused, not because she didn't know what to say, but because she knew what the truth was, and what he needed to hear. "Yes," she said softly. Yasin studied her face, searching for something deeper. Then he nodded, because he trusted her. Completely. After he fell asleep, Dalal sat alone, her hands resting loosely in her lap. The room was quiet. Too quiet. And in that silence, the weight she had been carrying all week finally settled fully. Not just as pressure, but as reality. She could not continue like this, not without something changing. Her thoughts returned once again to Kwame, not to the man himself, but to what he represented. Opportunity, support, possibility. Dalal closed her eyes briefly. She had resisted it, for good reason, because she understood the cost of accepting help that came with expectation. But now, the situation had shifted. This was no longer just about her. It was about Yasin. The next morning, Dalal made a decision, not fully formed, not fully comfortable, but necessary. She would not ask for help, but she would not reject it blindly either. At the restaurant, the day unfolded as expected, busy, demanding, relentless. Dalal moved through it with the same discipline, but something in her had changed. Not her strength, not her composure, but her willingness to consider a different path. Midway through her shift, a familiar presence entered the restaurant. Dalal felt it before she saw it. The subtle shift in attention, the quiet recognition. Kwame Mensah. He did not arrive with a group this time. He walked in alone, his presence still commanding, but quieter now, less performative. Dalal noticed him from across the room. Their eyes met briefly. Then she looked away, because nothing about this would be simple. Mr. Kofi moved quickly to greet him, his tone noticeably more respectful. "Welcome, sir." Kwame nodded. "Thank you." His gaze moved past the manager, scanning the room, looking. He found her. Dalal continued her work, not approaching immediately, because this time it would not happen on impulse. After several minutes, Mr. Kofi gestured toward her. "Dalal, attend to this table." She walked over slowly, her expression calm. "Good evening, sir." Kwame met her gaze. "Dalal." There was a pause. Not awkward, but intentional. "I didn't expect to see you here," she said. Kwame gave a small, almost thoughtful nod. "I was nearby." It wasn't a full answer, but it was enough. Dalal waited, because she knew he had more to say. "I've been thinking," Kwame began. Dalal tilted her head slightly. "About you," he said simply. Dalal did not react outwardly, but inside her guard remained firm. "And what did you conclude?" she asked. Kwame exhaled lightly. "That I still don't understand everything," he said, "but I understand more than before." Dalal considered that. "Understanding takes time," she replied. "I know." Another pause. Then Kwame spoke again. "I also realized something else." Dalal waited. "I shouldn't decide what you need," he said. The words landed differently this time, because they were not offered as correction. but as recognition. Dalal's expression softened slightly. "Then what are you doing here?" she asked. Kwame met her gaze directly, offering a choice. Dalal's breath slowed. Not from surprise, but from the weight of the moment. "What kind of choice?" she asked. Kwame reached into his jacket again, but this time he did not immediately extend the card. Instead, he held it loosely in his hand. "You can ignore this," he said. "Walk away. Continue as you are." Dalal listened carefully. Or he continued, "You can consider a different path, one where your ability is valued, where you are not used." The word lingered, because it was one she understood. Dalal looked at the card, then at him. "And what happens if I choose that path?" she asked. Kwame answered without hesitation. "You decide what comes next." For a moment, the world seemed to narrow, to a single point, a single decision. Dalal thought of Yasin, of the clinic, of the quiet calculations that no longer balanced. Then she looked back at Kwame. "This is not help," she said slowly. Kwame shook his head. "No, this is an opportunity, yes, and I owe you nothing." Kwame held her gaze. Nothing. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of possibility, of risk, of change. Dalal reached out, not quickly, not impulsively, but deliberately, and took the card. For the first time, she did not reject it. And for the first time, Kwame did not feel like he was giving something. He felt like he was being trusted, even if only a little. The moment Dalal took the card, nothing dramatic happened. There was no sudden relief, no immediate transformation, no visible change in the world around her. The restaurant continued to move at its usual pace, orders being called, glasses, clinking conversations rising and falling like waves. But internally, something had shifted. Not certainty, not trust, something quieter. A possibility she could no longer ignore. Kwame did not speak immediately after she took the card. He simply watched her, as if waiting for her to regret it, to hand it back, to step away from the moment entirely. But Dalal did none of those things. She placed the card carefully into her apron pocket, as though it were no more important than any other object she carried during her shift. Then she said softly, "I am still working." Kwame nodded once. "I know." And that was all. She turned and walked away. But for the first time, the distance between them did not feel like separation. It felt like space. The rest of Dalal's shift passed in a blur of motion and focus. Yet beneath her composure, her mind was no longer fully anchored in the present. The card in her pocket felt heavier than paper should, not because of what it was, but because of what it represented. Choice and consequences. That night after returning home, Dalal sat beside Yasin as he slept. His breathing was steady, but she noticed the slight tension in his shoulders, the quiet evidence of discomfort he tried not to show. She adjusted his blanket gently, then sat back, and allowed herself to think. The card lay on the small table beside her. Kwame Mensah's name printed in clean professional lettering. No promise written on it. No instruction, just access. Dalal stared at it for a long time. Because she understood something clearly now, this was not charity. Kwame did not present himself as a savior. He had stopped doing that. Instead, he was offering structure, a framework, a path she could choose to step onto or leave untouched. But even freedom Dalal knew could feel like pressure when survival was involved. She looked at Yasin again. His future was not a question anymore. It was a responsibility. And responsibilities did not wait for perfect conditions. The next morning, Dalal arrived at the restaurant earlier than usual. She moved through her tasks with quiet precision, but her attention was divided in a way she had not experienced before. At one point, Abena noticed. "You're distracted," she said softly while folding napkins. Dalal didn't deny it. "I am thinking," she replied. Abena raised an eyebrow. "About what?" Dalal paused, then simply said, "A decision." Abena studied her for a moment, but did not press further. Some things she understood were not meant to be shared lightly. By midday, Dalal had already spoken to 2 international guests in 3 different languages. Her mind worked as always, but now there was an additional layer beneath her thoughts, a persistent awareness of something waiting beyond the restaurant walls. A door she had not yet walked through. During her break, she stepped outside. The sun was sharp, the air heavy with heat and noise from the street. She pulled the card from her pocket again, read it, then closed her eyes briefly. She did not trust easily. Life had not given her reason to, but distrust alone was no longer enough to sustain her current reality. Yasin's treatment, the clinic visits, the growing expenses, the quiet strain he tried to hide. All of it pointed toward a limit she could not avoid. And then, as if the world itself had aligned with her thoughts, a voice interrupted. "Dalal!" She turned. Kwame stood a few steps away. Not inside the restaurant, not in a suit of authority. Just there, present. "I didn't expect you to come here," she said. "I didn't plan to," he replied. A brief pause. "But I thought you might have questions." Dalal studied him. "I have many," she said. Kwame nodded, then asked. Dalal folded her arms lightly. "If I accept this," she said, "what exactly am I stepping into?" Kwame did not answer immediately. He seemed to consider not just the question, but how to answer it honestly. "You would be working with my organization," he said finally. "Language services, international coordination, translation and high-level negotiations." Dalal listened carefully. "And the expectations? Precision? Reliability? Confidentiality?" She nodded slowly. "And control?" she asked. Kwame met her gaze. "You would not be controlled," he said, "but you would be accountable." Dalal absorbed that. It was different. Not ownership, not charity, structure. "And my position?" she asked. "You decide it," Kwame replied. Dalal frowned slightly. "That is not an answer. It is," he said, "but not a simple one." A silence settled between them. Not tense, but deliberate. Dalal looked away briefly toward the street, then back at him. "My brother is sick," she said quietly. Kwame did not react with surprise. He simply listened. "He needs treatment," she continued. "Regular treatment. Not occasional, not uncertain." Kwame nodded. "I understand." Dalal's voice remained steady, but something beneath it carried weight. "I cannot accept something that puts me in a position where I lose control of my life again." Kwame took that in. Then said softly, "You won't lose control." Dalal shook her head slightly. "You cannot guarantee that." Kwame did not argue, because she was right. He couldn't. Instead, he said, "Then don't trust the guarantee. Trust the structure." Dalal narrowed her eyes slightly. "What does that mean?" "It means you are not dependent on me personally," he said. "You are part of a system, one that exists whether I am present or not." Dalal considered that, carefully, because it mattered. "And if I refuse?" she asked. Kwame didn't hesitate. "Then nothing changes." Dalal studied him for a long moment. "You are offering me something you believe is fair," she said. "I am. But fairness is not always safety." Kwame nodded slowly. "I know." Another silence followed, this one longer, heavier. Dalal finally spoke. "If I agree," she said, "I will not accept pity or interference." Kwame nodded immediately. "You won't receive it, and I will not be used as a symbol." He met her gaze. "You won't be." Dalal exhaled slowly, then looked down at the card in her hand. "This is not a small decision," she said. "No," Kwame agreed, "it isn't." She looked at him again. "You are certain about what you are building?" Kwame paused, then answered honestly. "No." Dalal blinked slightly. That answer was unexpected. "But I am certain about one thing," he continued. Dalal waited. "That you are not where you are meant to stay." The words hung there, Not as persuasion, but as observation. Dalal looked at him for a long moment, then nodded once. "I will decide," she said. Kwame stepped back slightly. "That is all I ask." And then he left, without pressure, without insistence, just departure. Dalal stood alone again. But the decision no longer felt like something distant. It was now close. Very close. That evening she returned home earlier than usual. Yasin was awake. He looked at her immediately. "You're thinking too much again," he said softly. Dalal gave a faint smile. "I always think too much." He nodded. "That's why you find answers." She sat beside him. And for the first time, she did not hide the weight of her thoughts. "I may have to make a change," she said. Yasin looked at her carefully. What kind of change? Dalal hesitated, then answered honestly. "One that affects everything." Yasin didn't panic. He rarely did when she spoke like that. Instead, he simply asked, "Will it help us?" Dalal closed her eyes briefly. "Yes," she said. "I think it will." And in that moment, the decision once uncertain began to take shape, not as fear, not as escape, but as direction. The decision did not come in a single moment. It came in layers, quiet thoughts at night, small calculations during the day. The constant awareness that life as Dalal knew it was slowly pressing toward a point where staying the same would no longer be possible. But even with that realization, she did not rush. Dalal had learned that rushed decisions were often made for survival, not for life, and she needed both. 2 days passed before she saw Kwame again. Not because he avoided her, and not because she sought him out, but because both of them understood in their own way that what was forming between them could not be forced into urgency. It had to settle, like truth does when it is too heavy to float. On the 3rd day, Dalal received a message through Mr. Kofi. No explanation, just a location, a cafe not far from the restaurant, a time, and Kwame's name. She stared at the paper for a long moment, then folded it carefully and placed it in her pocket. She did not tell anyone, not Abena, not her manager, not even Yasin. Some decisions she understood needed silence before they could become real. That evening she arrived early. Kwame was already there, sitting alone, no entourage, no distance, just a man occupying a small table in a quiet corner, as if trying to remove every layer that usually surrounded him. When he saw her, he stood slightly, not out of obligation, but acknowledgement. "You came," he said. Dalal nodded once. "I said I would decide." Kwame gestured toward the seat across from him. Dalal sat, not immediately relaxed, but not guarded in the same way either. Something had changed in her posture. Not trust, but openness. Kwame studied her for a moment before speaking. "You took time," he said. "I needed it," she replied. He nodded. "I respect that." Dalal's gaze remained steady. "That is not what I am used to from people like you," she said. Kwame didn't take offense. "I am trying to change that." Dalal tilted her head slightly. "Trying is not the same as changing. I know." The honesty in his response lingered between them. Dalal leaned back slightly. "I have questions," she said. "I expected that." She crossed her arms gently. "If I join your organization, what happens when you disagree with my decisions?" Kwame answered without hesitation. "We discuss them. And if I refuse your suggestion, then you refuse it." Dalal watched him carefully. "And there are no consequences for that." Kwame shook his head. "Not for disagreement. A pause. Only for responsibility." Dalal absorbed that. Slowly, carefully. Because it was different from what she had expected. "And my brother?" she asked. Kwame's expression softened slightly. "He will have access to care," he said. "Consistent care. Not conditional." Dalal studied him. Why Kwame didn't pretend the question was simple. "Because I can," he said. then added quietly, "And because I should." There was no performance in his voice, no attempt to persuade, only certainty about action, not intention. Dalal looked down at her hands for a moment, then back at him. "I don't want charity," she said again. Kwame nodded. "I know. I don't want to owe anyone my life." "You won't owe me your life," he replied. Dalal narrowed her eyes slightly. "Then what will I owe?" Kwame paused. "Your work," he said, "and your honesty." The answer surprised her, not because it was generous, but because it was specific. She exhaled slowly. "You are asking me to trust a system built by you," Kwame corrected her gently. "A system built around function," he said. "Not me." Dalal considered that, then asked, "And what do you get from this?" Kwame did not hesitate. "Better communication," he said, "better outcomes, fewer mistakes." Dalal tilted her head slightly. "That sounds like business." "It is." A pause, and also not. Dalal studied him for a long moment, then spoke more quietly. "You still don't fully understand me." Kwame nodded. "I don't." "That hasn't changed." "No." "Then why continue?" Kwame leaned forward slightly. "Because I don't need full understanding to respect value." The words landed differently this time, not as admiration, but as acknowledgement. Dalal looked away briefly. The cafe around them remained calm, indifferent to their conversation. People passed by, unaware of the quiet shift unfolding at a small table in the corner. When she looked back, her voice was softer. "You don't know what it costs me to say yes," she said. Kwame met her gaze. "I don't," he admitted, "but I know it costs something." Dalal nodded. "It does." Silence settled again, this one deeper, more final. Kwame placed a folder on the table. "This is the offer," he said. "You don't have to sign today." Dalal didn't touch it, not yet. "What if I fail?" she asked. Kwame answered simply. "Then you learn. And if I cannot keep up, you adjust. And if I leave," Kwame didn't hesitate, "then you leave." Dalal studied him closely. There was no tightening of control in his answers, no hidden conditions, only structure. Finally, she asked the question she had avoided. "Why me?" Kwame leaned back slightly. For the first time, he looked away, not from discomfort, but from thought. Then he said, "Because you didn't change when I tried to make you smaller." Dalal didn't respond immediately. The words stayed in the air longer than expected. She closed her eyes briefly, then opened them again. "I will not be controlled," she said. Kwame nodded. "You won't be. I will not be displayed. You won't be. I will not be reduced to a story people tell about themselves." Kwame met her gaze. "Then don't become one." That answer stayed with her, longer than the others. Dalal reached out slowly. Not to the pen, not yet, but to the folder. She opened it, read the first page, then the second, then stopped. "I will not be easy to manage," she said. Kwame almost smiled. "I would be disappointed if you were." Another pause, this one different. Less weight, more clarity. Dalal picked up the pen, held it above the page, then looked at him one final time. "This is not trust," she said. Kwame nodded. "I know, it is choice, yes." She signed. And for the first time, her life did not shift because it was forced, but because she allowed it to. Kwame did not celebrate. He simply closed the folder, nodded once, and said quietly, "Welcome." Dalal stood. "I start tomorrow," she said. Kwame nodded again. "I'll be there." She paused, then added, "Not to control." Kwame met her gaze. "No," he said, "to listen." Dalal left. And for the first time in a long time, she did not feel like she was running. She felt like she was stepping forward. The first day of change rarely feels like change at all. For Dalal, it began with routine. She woke up at the same hour, moved through the same small room, checked on Yasin as he slept, and prepared for work in the same quiet, disciplined way she always had. Even the streets of Accra seemed unchanged vendors calling out taxis, honking the morning sun rising over familiar rooftops. But something inside her had shifted. Not loudly, not visibly, but permanently. When she arrived at the address Kwame had given her, it was not what she expected. A modern office building in a quieter part of the city, not the towering corporate glass she associated with wealth, but something more structured, more grounded. The reception area was simple, the staff professional but not intimidating. There was no feeling of excess, only order. "You're early," a voice said. Dalal turned. Kwame stood a few steps away, dressed more simply than she had ever seen him before. No loud luxury, no visible display of status. Just a clean, tailored shirt and a calm expression. "I am always early," she replied. He nodded slightly. "I remember." He led her inside without ceremony. No announcements, no introductions, no spotlight. Just movement. The office she was shown to was quiet, with a desk, a chair, and a computer. Nothing more. "This is yours," Kwame said. Dalal looked around, and the expectations. He leaned lightly against the doorframe. "Accuracy," he said. "Judgment, communication." Dalal turned to him. "That's it." Kwame nodded. "That's it." She sat down slowly. Not because she doubted the role, but because she was observing it, testing whether it was real. Kwame didn't leave immediately. Instead, he added, "You won't be observed constantly. You won't be tested. You won't be showcased." Dalal looked at him. "That's new," she said. He gave a faint, almost self-aware smile. "It shouldn't be." Then he left. The first hours passed quietly. Dalal worked through documents, translated messages, reviewed communication drafts. It was precise work language used not for performance, but for clarity. There were no crowds watching her, no customers testing her, no whispers following her steps. Only tasks. Only structure. And in that structure, something unfamiliar began to settle. Space. At midday, a colleague introduced herself. "My name is Ama Serwa," she said politely. "I handle coordination for international clients." Dalal nodded. "Dalal?" Ama smiled slightly. "I heard about you," she said. Dalal paused. From where Ama hesitated, then shrugged lightly. "Everywhere." Dalal didn't respond. She had expected that. But what she hadn't expected was how ordinary everything felt. Not small, not insignificant, just normal. And normal after everything felt like something she had almost forgotten how to trust. Meanwhile, across the city, Kwame observed quietly from his own office, not monitoring, not controlling, just watching the system function without interference. Kojo Bediako stood beside him. "You didn't assign her anything difficult," Kojo noted. Kwame shook his head. "I didn't assign her anything unnecessary." Kojo glanced at him. "That's new for you." Kwame didn't deny it. "I'm learning," he said simply. Kojo smiled faintly. So is she. Days passed. Dalal adjusted quickly, not because the work was easy, but because it was honest. Language here was not a performance. It was a tool. Precision mattered more than display. Clarity mattered more than impression. And for the first time in a long time, she did not feel like she had to prove her worth every second she existed in a space. But change is never without tension. At the restaurant, Abena noticed first. "She's gone," she said one evening to another waitress. "What do you mean, gone? She doesn't come here anymore." The words carried something heavier than observation. Mr. Kofi Adu noticed too, not immediately, but gradually. The attention that had once surrounded Dalal began to fade. The curiosity, the customers, the social media attention, it shifted elsewhere, as attention always does. And without it, something in the restaurant felt quieter, less profitable, less exciting. and that absence created discomfort. One evening, Kwame called Dalal into a meeting. She arrived as usual, calm, composed, observant. "You're adjusting well," he said. Dalal nodded. "I understand the system." Kwame leaned forward slightly. "That's not what I'm asking." She looked at him. "What are you asking?" A pause. "Are you all right?" The question surprised her. Not because it was invasive, but because it was unnecessary in a professional context. Dalal considered it carefully, then answered honestly. "Yes." Kwame studied her. "That's not a complete answer." Dalal tilted her head slightly. "It is the only one I have right now." He nodded slowly, then added, "You don't have to prove anything here." Dalal held his gaze. "I know." A pause. "But I still will," she said quietly. Kwame didn't argue, because he understood that instinct better than most. Outside, Yasin's condition was improving slowly, not dramatically, but steadily. Medication was consistent now. Checkups were scheduled. The stress that had once hung over Dalal's decisions had not disappeared, but it had become manageable. For the first time in months, she could plan beyond survival. One evening after work, Kwame walked with her part of the way home. Not as an employer, not as authority, just as a presence beside her. "You're quieter than before," he said. Dalal glanced at him. "I am focused." He nodded. "On what?" She hesitated. "Stability," she said. Kwame accepted that, then asked, and after that Dalal looked forward. "I don't know yet." Kwame didn't press. Instead, he said something unexpected. "Neither do I." Dalal looked at him briefly. "You built all this," she said. "Yes. And you still don't know." Kwame shook his head slightly. Knowing how something works doesn't always mean knowing where it's going. They walked in silence for a while. Not uncomfortable, just reflective. Finally, Dalal spoke. "I thought you wanted control." Kwame smiled faintly. "I thought I did too." She looked at him. And now he paused. "Now I want clarity more than control." Dalal nodded slowly. "That's harder." Yes, he agreed. "It is." When they reached her street, Kwame stopped. "I won't always walk you home," he said. Dalal nodded. "I know." A pause. "But you did when it mattered," she said. Kwame looked at her. "And did it matter?" Dalal considered the question, then answered. "Yes." She turned to leave, but before she did, she added quietly, "This is still new." Kwame nodded. "For both of us." Dalal walked away. And this time she did not look back, because for the first time she wasn't leaving something behind. She was building something forward. Change does not announce its arrival loudly. It settles, slowly, quietly, until one day life no longer resembles what it used to be. For Dalal Hassan, the transformation was not dramatic. There was no single moment where everything became perfect, no sudden resolution that erased the past. Instead, there was consistency, work that respected her ability, a routine that did not punish her existence, a stability that allowed her to breathe without calculating survival every hour. She still woke early. She still checked on Yasin. She still moved through the day with discipline. But now there was something different beneath it all. Choice. At her new role, Dalal quickly became known not as a spectacle, but as something far more valuable, reliable precision. International partners trusted her translations. Negotiations moved more smoothly when she was involved. Language barriers that once created delays were now resolved with quiet efficiency. But what surprised her most was not the work itself. It was the absence of pressure to perform. No one asked her to prove her languages anymore. No one turned her ability into entertainment. She was simply trusted. and her trust, she realized, was far more powerful than attention. Kwame Mensah observed from a distance, but not in the way he once did. He no longer watched her as an anomaly. He watched her as part of a system he was still learning how to refine. And more importantly, he listened. Not just to her words, but to her boundaries. One afternoon, Kojo Bediako visited Kwame's office. "You've changed the structure again?" Kojo said, reviewing a report. Kwame nodded. "Yes." Kojo looked up. Because of her, Kwame didn't deny it. "Because of what I learned from her," he corrected. Kojo studied him for a moment. "And what did you learn?" Kwame leaned back slightly. "That respect is not something you give after understanding," he said. "It's something you give before it." Kojo smiled faintly. "That's expensive thinking." Kwame returned the smile. "So is ignorance." Meanwhile, Dalal's life at home was also changing. Yasin was improving steadily, not cured, but stable. His strength returned gradually in small signs, a longer walk without resting, a brighter tone in his voice, a willingness to laugh again. One evening, he sat beside Dalal and asked something he had not asked in a long time. "Are we still struggling?" Dalal paused, then answered honestly, "No." Yasin looked at her carefully. "Then what are we?" Dalal thought for a moment. "Building," she said. It was not a word she had used before, but it felt right. Months passed. Seasons shifted. And Dalal became someone people within the organization no longer introduced with hesitation or curiosity, but with quiet respect. Not because of her past, but because of her presence. She did not forget where she came from, but she no longer lived inside it. One evening, Kwame requested a meeting. Not formal, not structured, just conversation. They met at a quiet rooftop space overlooking the city. The lights of Accra stretched out beneath them like a living map of movement and memory. Dalal arrived first. Kwame joined her a few minutes later. Neither spoke immediately. Finally, Kwame broke the silence. "You've done well here," he said. Dalal nodded slightly. "So have your systems." He gave a faint smile. "They work better with you in them." Dalal looked at him. "That sounds like dependency." Kwame shook his head. "No," he said. "It sounds like alignment." She considered that. Then asked, "What happens next?" Kwame looked out over the city. "That depends," he said. "On what?" "On whether you want more." Dalal didn't answer immediately, because she understood what more meant. Not pressure, not expectation, but expansion. "I don't want to lose what I've built," she said finally. Kwame nodded. "Then don't." A pause. "And if I stay where I am?" "Then you stay," he said simply. Dalal studied him. "No persuasion." Kwame shook his head. No control. The honesty of it settled between them. Different from the beginning, different from everything before. Dalal exhaled slowly. "I used to think people like you always want something in return," she said. Kwame looked at her. "And now I think some people just want things to work." Kwame nodded. "Sometimes that's all it is." Silence returned. But it was no longer heavy. It was understanding. Dalal stood slowly. "I need to go," she said. Kwame nodded. "I know." A pause. Then he added, "Dalal." She looked back. "Yes. Thank you," he said. "Not for performance, not for compliance, but for change." Dalal didn't respond immediately. Then she nodded once. "You're welcome." And she left. Months later, Dalal stood in a different space entirely. Not the restaurant, not the office, but a small community center in Accra where she had begun teaching language skills to young students free of charge, not as charity, but as structure. A way to pass forward what she once struggled alone to learn. Yasin sat in the back of the room watching quietly, healthy enough now to attend regularly, stronger than before, not just physically, but in spirit. After the class ended, he approached her. "You built this," he said. Dalal smiled. "We built this," she corrected. Outside, the city continued as always, loud, fast, unpredictable. But inside that small space, something different existed. Continuity. Later that day, Kwame visited. He did not interrupt the class. He stood at the back, observing. When it ended, Dalal approached him. "You still watch too much," she said lightly. Kwame smiled. "Old habit." She crossed her arms. Still trying to understand, Kwame shook his head. "No," he said. "Now I'm trying to maintain." Dalal raised an eyebrow slightly. "That sounds like control again." Kwame laughed softly. "No," he said. "It sounds like respect." Dalal studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Good." There was no final confession, no dramatic conclusion, no symbolic ending, only continuation. Because life as Dalal now understood was not a story that ended when everything was solved. It was a process of learning how to live without being reduced, without being controlled, without being unseen. And for Kwame Mensah, it was the realization that power was not measured by how much you could take, but by how much you could choose not to. And so they moved forward, not as savior and subject, not as billionaire and waitress, but as two people who had once misunderstood each other and chose not to stay that way. This story is a reminder that human worth is never defined by status appearance or the job someone is forced to do in order to survive. Dalal was seen as just a waitress in the eyes of many people, yet behind that label was a woman carrying extraordinary strength, intelligence, and resilience. Her ability to speak multiple languages was not what made her valuable, but the years of discipline, pain, and quiet determination behind it. Too often in life, people rush to judge others based on what is visible on the surface, forgetting that the deepest parts of a person's story are usually the ones they never share. Kwame's journey also reflects an important truth. Power without awareness can easily turn into blindness. He had money, influence, and control over environments, but none of that protected him from misunderstanding another human being. It took humility, listening, and the willingness to be corrected for him to begin changing. Real strength is not in being right all the time, but in being willing to recognize when you are wrong and choosing to grow from it. At the heart of this story is also the idea that help is not always healing when it comes from control. True support does not decide for someone else's life. It creates space for them to choose their own path. Dalal did not need to be saved. She needed to be seen respected and given the chance to step forward on her own terms. That difference is what transforms help into dignity. And perhaps the most important lesson is this: life changes when people stop reducing each other. When we begin to see others fully, not as roles or assumptions, but as complete human beings with history, struggle, and potential, something powerful shifts. Respect becomes the foundation for everything else. If this story touched you in any way, share your thoughts in the comments. What moment impacted you the most, and why your voice matters, and your perspective helps keep these stories alive. And if you enjoy emotional storytelling that reflects real human struggles, healing, and transformation, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories like this.